Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we step beside Miss Marple as an impossible letter arrives, bearing a stamp from nowhere at all. A quiet village, a whisper of secrecy, and a question that chills the heart: who sent it, and why now? Tell me, are you listening in the late hours or by the morning light? Now, pour yourself something warm, and let the mystery begin. St. Mary Mead's High Street carried its usual morning hush, the kind that settled like a well-worn shawl over the village after the first post had been delivered. Sunlight rested gently on the thatched roofs, and the scent of damp earth from the previous night's drizzle mingled with the promise of an ordinary day. Yet beneath that homely stillness, there came like a clock, hesitating between ticks, a faint sense that something had shifted, the sort of subtle tremor only the most attentive souls would ever feel. Miss Marple, who was returning from the greengrocer with a modest paper bag of carrots and a single Bramley apple, felt that hesitation more keenly than most. She paused beside the stone wall bordering the vicarage garden, adjusting her lace gloves with mild distraction. Just ahead, Miss Hartnell was speaking rather too energetically to Mr. Clegg, the postmaster, her walking stick tapping nervously at the cobblestones. "I tell you, it simply cannot be right," Miss Hartnell declared, her voice pitched at a level that invited listeners whether they wished to be engaged or not. "If a letter bears no postmark, then it cannot have passed through any respectable system, and yet, here it is, delivered by our own hand." Mr. Clegg, who prided himself on being unflappable, tugged at his mustache. "Well, Miss Hartnell, I assure you it came through the usual channels, or at least through a channel. One cannot always account for every smudge or stamp." Miss Marple passed them with a polite nod, though she noted the unusual stiffness in Mr. Clegg's shoulders. In St. Mary Mead, such small alterations in composure spoke volumes. As she continued toward the lane that led to her cottage, she could not help recalling odd letters she had seen over the years, anonymous ones that broke households, belated ones that soothed them, and mistaken ones that caused far more trouble than they ever intended. The village, of course, reacted swiftly to news of the stamped but unstamped letter. By mid-morning, Mrs. Price Ridley had cornered Mrs. Bartlett outside the butcher's, asserting with great authority that foreign hands must have been involved. "These things begin abroad," she insisted. "Strange customs, foreign inks, mysterious postal contraptions. Next thing you know, we'll all be receiving blank envelopes full of fumes." "And to whom was it addressed?" Mrs. Bartlett whispered, though her whisper could carry half the length of the High Street when properly encouraged. "Well," Mrs. Price Ridley began, lowering her voice with theatrical reluctance, "I have it on excellent authority that it was addressed to—" But she stopped abruptly as the vicar approached, offering a genial nod. She transformed her expression into that solemn propriety she believed befitted clergy-facing moments. Miss Marple, listening from a discreet distance while examining turnips through the greengrocer's window, was struck by how swiftly gossip had stitched itself into a kind of pattern. A mysterious letter, a missing postmark, an addressee whose name had not yet been spoken aloud. In her experience, the village never rallied around an unknown. It reached instinctively toward the familiar, like a hand seeking a banister in the dark. The silence surrounding the recipient, then, was telling in itself. Her musings were interrupted when Mrs. Clement hurried toward her, cheeks flushed and bonnet askew. "Oh, Miss Marple, me dear, how fortunate I am to have found you. I'm afraid something awfully odd has occurred at the vicarage. Would you, if you could spare a moment, to come with me?" Miss Marple accepted at once, her carrots rustling softly in their bag as she turned. Mrs. Clement's anxious pace and unusual discomposure suggested a matter of real concern, not the usual mild domestic emergencies. They walked briskly to the vicarage, where the hallway seemed unsettled, somehow too quiet, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Mrs. Clement guided her toward the sitting room, its warm fire crackling in a way that felt strangely at odds with the tension hovering in the air. On the small writing desk near the window lay a single envelope, cream-colored, ordinary in size. Yet its stamp was immaculate, pristine, perfect, and wholly untouched by any postmark. The ink of the addressee's name appeared old-fashioned, perhaps even hesitant, each letter formed with careful, almost overly deliberate strokes. Miss Marple's gaze softened with recognition, not of the name itself, which she could not see from her angle, but of the unsettling familiarity of human secrecy. The vicar found it on the mat, Mrs. Clement whispered. Just after breakfast. No knock, no footsteps. And I must tell you, Miss Marple, the name on it well. It's rather delicate. Miss Marple moved closer, her footsteps blending with the fire's quiet crackle. She gently inclined her head, allowing the addressee's name to come into view. Her hand paused mid-air. For though the envelope lay innocently enough, its surface bore the unmistakable name of a man who had been dead for nearly 7 years. A ripple of something cold and deliberate moved through the room, touching the edges of every shadow. Miss Marple did not speak. Not yet. Instead, she studied the letter the way a seasoned gardener studies a sudden blight, quietly, patiently, knowing such signs rarely appeared without deeper roots. Behind her, Mrs. Clement exhaled a tremulous breath, the sound fragile as thin glass. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, a faint thud echoed soft, uncertain, yet distinctly out of place. Miss Marple lifted her gaze toward the hallway, her expression composed but keen, like someone listening for the next tick of a clock that had just faltered. The faint thud drew Miss Marple's attention toward the shadowed corridor, where the air felt curiously strained, as though the house itself was reluctant to reveal what it had heard. Mrs. Clement hesitated beside her, clasping her hands tightly against her apron, the gesture betraying more unease than she wished to show. "Thought the vicar was in his study," she whispered, glancing toward the closed door at the far end of the hall. Miss Marple offered a calming nod and stepped gently toward the sound's origin. The corridor smelled faintly of beeswax and old books, comforting scents now made oddly sharp by the silence pressing around them. She pushed open the door to the small cloakroom, where coats and rain boots lined the narrow space. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance, no fallen umbrella, no displaced scarf. But the window latch, she noticed, was slightly raised, the smallest glint of metal catching the morning light. "Perhaps the wind," Mrs. Clement murmured behind her, though her tone carried little conviction. Miss Marple touched the latch, still warm from a recent hand. Someone had opened the window not long before, perhaps only moments ahead of their arrival. The idea lingered in the air like a held breath. Returning to the sitting room, she found the vicar standing stiffly beside the writing desk, his expression somewhere between indignation and worry. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, voice too hearty to be natural, "I do apologize for the commotion. My wife's imagination tends to take leaps." Mrs. Clement colored, but Miss Marple only offered a serene, deferential smile. "I imagine," she said gently, "that such a letter would cause anyone's mind to stir a little. It is not every day one receives correspondence addressed to a man long departed." The vicar winced. "Yes, well quid. The name on it, as you saw it, was Edwin Hallam. You recall the unpleasantness around his death. The village has never agreed on the particulars." Miss Marple remembered very well. Mr. Hallam had collapsed during a garden party at the vicarage, sunshine, lemonade, polite conversation, and minutes later the man was gone, taken by what the doctor declared a sudden failure of the heart. Yet rumors had threaded through the village for months afterward. Whispers about debts, disputes, a quarrel overheard behind the churchyard yews. Nothing proven, nothing resolved. And now, the vicar continued, rubbing the bridge of his nose, a letter for him, delivered without a sound. Mrs. Clement added, "We found it exactly there, on the mat. How could anyone have left it without us hearing?" I was in the kitchen for only a moment. Miss Marple glanced again at the envelope on the desk. Its surface seemed almost too pristine, as though handled with deliberate care. Appearances, she reflected, often behaved like courteous masks hiding what ought to be looked at most closely. "Has it been opened?" she asked. "No," the vicar said quickly. "I thought it best left untouched until we sought advice." His glance flicked to her, uneasy yet hopeful. "You always seem to understand matters when they turn peculiar." Before Miss Marple could reply, the doorbell rang sharp, insistent, cutting through the subdued room like a blade. Mrs. Clement hurried to answer it, and moments later, Miss Hartnell swept in, her expression fierce with purpose. "I came at once," she announced, brandishing her walking stick like a scepter. "Mr. Clegg is in quite a state over at the post office, and I shall not have the village plunged into confusion without proper witnesses. Has the letter been authenticated? Has anyone considered forgery, anonymous mischief, foreign tampering?" Her voice rose with each theory, and the vicar's discomfort became nearly visible. Miss Marple, however, studied Miss Hartnell with renewed interest. Her agitation seemed rather too pointed, as though she were determined to steer the narrative before it settled in less convenient places. "Curious you should come so quickly," Miss Marple said softly. "You seemed most invested this morning." Miss Hartnell blinked, stiffening. "Well, someone must take things in hand when the vicarage is under attack by postal absurdities." Outside, the church bell chimed the half-hour its echo drifting through the open window, mingling with the uneasy silence that followed Miss Marple's remark. She turned once more toward the mysterious envelope, noting how the ink of the name had begun to fade into the paper as though retreating from the light. A thought brushed the edge of her mind quiet, fragile, not yet shaped into certainty. The fragile thought that brushed Miss Marple's mind lingered like dust in a sunbeam visible for a second, then gone the moment one reached for it. She let her gaze rest on the envelope a moment longer before turning toward the anxious faces around her. The vicar shifted from foot to foot, Miss Hartnell bristled with defensive certainty, and Mrs. Clement clutched the edge of the sideboard as though steadying herself against an unseen draught. "It would be helpful," Miss Marple said gently, "if we might consider how the letter came to rest where it did. Such things rarely appear without intention." Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Intention or mischief. And mischief has a way of finding foolish homes." Her eyes slid toward Mrs. Clement in a manner that made the poor woman redden. The vicar interjected quickly. "Let us not accuse one another. The matter is peculiar enough without sparking quarrels." Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the slightly lifted window latch the warmth of metal touched not long ago. A simple sign, easily overlooked, yet the kind that often separated truth from the village's preferred narratives. She folded her hands neatly before her. "If someone wished to place a letter unseen," she began, "the window in the cloakroom offers a convenient approach. The hedge outside provides cover, and the latch is light enough to lift without effort. One could slip the envelope through and let it fall quietly." Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. But who would go to such lengths, and why revisit a man's name after so long? "Sometimes," Miss Marple murmured, "past matters hold a grip stronger than the present cares to admit." Before the vicar could respond, a brisk knock sounded on the open doorway, and Inspector Graves stepped inside, his coat still smelling faintly of the morning chill. A lean man with sharp features softened only by a faintly apologetic manner. He surveyed the room with the resigned air of someone long accustomed to arriving after gossip had already taken root. "Morning all," he said. "I've had word there's been some unusual post delivered here. Thought I'd best take a look before rumor outruns sense." Miss Hartnell seized the moment. "Inspector, this is a very serious matter. A letter addressed to a dead man, and delivered by means most irregular. The entire postal system may be compromised." Inspector Graves gave a polite nod, neither agreeing nor dismissing. He turned instead to Miss Marple, recognizing immediately the quiet intelligence in her posture. "You've seen it, Miss Marple." "I have," she replied, "though one must be careful not to let the oddness of a thing make it more dramatic than it is. Still, the absence of a postmark and the method of delivery are curious." He approached the desk, lifting the envelope delicately by its corners. His eyes narrowed as he inspected the stamp. "Clean as a whistle," he muttered. "Too clean. Either it was never processed, or someone has gone to pains to make it appear untouched." Miss Hartnell's voice sharpened. "Forgery, then?" "Possibly," Graves replied. "Possibly not. Could be a private arrangement. Could be old stock." He paused. "Could be a message someone wanted to see without delay." Mrs. Clement shivered. A message from whom? And why Mr. Hallam? The inspector's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Hallam, yes. His name still stirs discomfort. Any chance it's connected to his death?" The question hung in the air like a drifting cobweb, delicate yet unsettling. Miss Marple sensed the vicar stiffen. Grief and old guilt often shared indistinguishable postures. She stepped closer to the window where the faint breeze carried the smell of damp leaves. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "a reminder of the past seeks the one place it feels unfinished." Inspector Graves turned toward her. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she replied softly, "that we might consider not only who sent the letter, but who most feared its arrival." Her words landed with a subtle weight. Miss Hartnell's face clouded. Mrs. Clement's breath caught. The vicar avoided her gaze altogether. Graves seemed to recognize the shift. "Right," he said, clearing his throat. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Clegg at the post office, and I'll ask a few questions about anyone seen near the vicarage this morning, but I'd appreciate it if none of you touched this until I returned." As he slipped the envelope into an evidence sleeve, the paper's faint stiffness gave a slight crackle, an incongruous, almost furtive sound. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement, and a quiet realization brushed her mind again, slightly firmer this time. Something about the handwriting, not what it revealed, but what it concealed. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to linger on the thought murmuring at the edge of clarity, yet she did not grasp it fully. Instead, she watched Inspector Graves tuck the envelope safely away and stride toward the door. When he was gone, the room remained suspended in a peculiar hush, as though everyone waited for someone else to speak first. It was Miss Hartnell who broke the silence, her chin lifting with indignation. "Well, I trust the inspector will look into the proper avenues. One never knows what sort of person might take advantage of a peaceful village like ours." The vicar gave a weary sigh. "We should all remain calm, Miss Hartnell. Jumping to blame benefits no one." But Miss Marple had already turned a thoughtful gaze toward the older woman. Miss Hartnell's agitation was too brisk, too preemptive, like a curtain drawn before anyone thought to look at the window behind it. And there was the curious matter of her earlier insistence at the post office, a detail now quietly aligning with the faint shape of Miss Marple's half-formed intuition. She stepped closer to Mrs. Clement, who was anxiously polishing the same patch of the sideboard. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I should not worry about you. Often when something odd occurs, people's reactions tell us more than the event itself. Fear has a way of hurrying to the surface." Miss Hartnell bristled. "And what, pray, does that mean?" "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple answered sweetly, her eyes drifting toward the window latch in the adjoining corridor. "Only that unusual circumstances tend to unsettle even the steadiest temperament." Miss Hartnell's grip tightened on her walking stick. "I'm perfectly steady." "Of course you are," Miss Marple murmured. The vicar, seeing yet another quarrel rising, ushered Miss Marple aside. "Would you advise anything, Miss Marple? Should we inform the parish committee? We will talk about whatever we do." "There will be talk," she agreed softly, "but perhaps best not to give it more fuel than necessary." The vicar nodded, though unease clung to him like fog. Miss Marple knew his discomfort went deeper than the letter itself. Edwin Hallam's death had cast a long shadow, and the vicarage had never entirely escaped the faint aroma of scandal that followed it. A reminder, especially in written form, could easily stir guilt or suspicion in all the wrong quarters. As she prepared to leave, Miss Hartnell intercepted her at the doorway. "You see," she said sharply, "this whole affair reeks of someone attempting to stir up old ghosts." I told Mr. Clegg the same. There are people in this village who benefit from drama, people who enjoy the attention. "Do you think so?" Miss Marple asked mildly, observing the tension in the woman's jaw. "I know so," Miss Hartnell insisted. "And if you must know, I've always felt there was more to Mr. Hallam's passing than the doctor claimed. Sudden collapse in the middle of the vicar's garden. Nonsense. But everyone preferred to let the matter lie. Some things," Miss Marple said gently, "lie only because we choose not to look beneath them." Miss Hartnell's eyes flashed. "Well, then perhaps someone has chosen to look now, and not for honest reasons." She stalked down the path, leaving the vicarage gate swinging slightly behind her. The motion seemed to punctuate her agitation, the rhythmic sway echoing the village's growing unease. Miss Marple remained on the step a moment longer, scanning the hedge that shielded the cloakroom window. Its branches showed the faintest disturbance, a subtle parting that suggested recent passage. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough. Her mind sifted the patterns quietly. Fearful defensiveness, hurried conclusions, eagerness to direct suspicion outward. Miss Hartnell's behavior echoed all three. And Miss Hartnell, Miss Marple recalled, had been one of the last to see Edwin Hallam alive at that garden party. A small detail at the time. Perhaps not so small now. A soft breeze rustled the hedge again, drawing her attention to a glint caught at its base. She stepped closer. Half tucked in the greenery lay a small scrap of cream-colored paper, its torn edge matching the texture of the envelope she had earlier inspected. She retrieved it delicately. The fragment bore a faint trace of handwriting, as though someone had tested a pen before writing the letter proper. The ink had hesitated mid-stroke, showing the tremor of a hand afraid of being recognized. Miss Marple held the scrap between her fingers, letting the faint breeze lift its torn edge. The hesitation in the ink spoke of a hand uncertain either from age, fear, or the weight of something long concealed. She slipped the fragment discreetly into her glove and straightened, her gaze drifting toward the lane where Miss Hartnell had marched away moments earlier. A cautious step sounded behind her. Mrs. Clement stood in the doorway, worry etched across her features. "Is Miss Marple very serious?" Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile. "Serious, my dear?" "Not yet, but curious, exceedingly curious. And curiosity in villages has a habit of growing into something larger unless one trims it early." Mrs. Clement nodded, though her hands remained knotted together. "I know everyone thinks Miss Hartnell rash, but she wasn't always so prickly. After Mr. Hallam died, she changed, not just her disposition of her routines. She stopped going to the Wednesday choir practice. She stopped calling on the vicarage except for official matters. It was as though she no longer trusted herself in company. People retreat for many reasons," Miss Marple murmured. "Loss can distort how we see the world." "And guilt?" Mrs. Clement asked faintly. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she stepped down the path, her feet finding the familiar gravel rhythm. Mrs. Clement followed, unable to keep her thoughts from spilling. There were whispers that you remember, that she and Mr. Hallam had quarreled by the tea-urn. Something about a church fund, but no one confirmed it. "Rumors often flourish where details are lacking," Miss Marple said gently. "A quarrel does not make a murderer. Nor does grief." But a letter now addressed to him Mrs. Clement swallowed. What could it possibly mean after 7 years? "It means," Miss Marple replied, "that someone has not forgotten." On the high street, Miss Marple walked with quiet purpose, the village around her humming with the mid-morning bustle. She paused outside the post office, where Mr. Clegg was adjusting the blinds with more fussiness than usual. His movements betrayed distraction. His shoulders shifted restlessly, as though bearing some invisible weight. When she entered, he startled slightly. "Miss Marple, I've told the inspector everything, absolutely everything. No mysterious parcels, no special requests, nothing out of order." She smiled in her kind way. "I'm certain you have, Mr. Clegg. But I wondered, has anyone lately asked about outdated stamps or inquired after old stationery? Some people have a fondness for these things." He hesitated, only a flicker, but noticeable. "Outdated stamps? Well, Miss Hartnell buys them sometimes. Says they're more economical, but that hardly means anything." "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly. "And aside from her?" Mr. Clegg fidgeted with a stack of envelopes. "Well, there was someone yesterday. Young Mr. Ben Lacey. He wanted to know whether an old stamp found in one of his father's books could still be used. I told him it could, of course, as long as it wasn't damaged." Ben Lacey. Ah, yes. His mother was connected to the Halams through her cousin, I believe. Something like that. He rubbed his temple. He seemed nervous, though. Kept glancing at the door as if afraid his father might walk in. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped out into the sunlight, the air filled with the distant clatter of a passing bicycle. Ben Lacey. A name not much in circulation lately. A quiet boy grown into a quiet young man, hard-working, polite, but carrying a reserve that felt older than his years. If he had been handling old stamps, perhaps he had unknowingly used one on the mysterious envelope. But the tremor in the handwriting that had not been a young man's hand. As she walked toward the crossroads, she saw Ben himself emerging from the bakery with a loaf under his arm. He spotted her and hesitated, a brief startled tension crossing his face before he stepped forward with a polite greeting. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Ben. I heard you've been sorting through some of your father's books. A nostalgic exercise, I hope." His fingers tightened on the bread wrapper. "Yes, well, just clearing things. He doesn't use them anymore." "Books hold such interesting mementos," she said kindly. "Letters tucked away, scraps of paper, tokens of old friendships, even stamps." Ben's gaze flickered ever so slightly toward the vicarage in the distance. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words seemed to falter before they formed. Ben's lips parted, but whatever explanation hovered there dissolved in the morning air. His eyes remained fixed briefly, involuntarily on the distant vicarage roofline. Miss Marple did not pressure him. In her long experience, only taught people to tighten their secrets. "Clearing books can be a sentimental business," she said, giving him the gentlest path to speak. "One never knows what old correspondence might tumble out. A receipt, a theater ticket, even a forgotten envelope." His throat bobbed. "I didn't find any envelopes, not even one addressed to someone unexpected." He flinched, an unmistakable instinctive recoil, but quickly attempted a smile. It wavered like a candle caught by a drought. "No, nothing like that. I only found a stamp, that's all. Just something from an old album. And you asked Mr. Clegg if it was still usable." He hesitated. "Yes. Just curiosity." The unease in his posture, however, suggested something far more substantial than curiosity. Yet Miss Marple sensed it was not guilt that weighed heavily on him, but rather fear of being drawn into something he barely understood. She let the moment settle. "Your father was fond of Mr. Hallam, I believe." Ben blinked at that unexpected thread. "My father? No, not particularly. He didn't dislike him, but they weren't close. They served on one committee together, village improvements, or something like that. It ended with an argument, actually." "An argument?" Miss Marple echoed softly. "Yes." Ben shifted the loaf to his other arm. "Something about misallocated funds. I never heard the details." only that it embarrassed father terribly. He hated talk of impropriety. Miss Marple absorbed this with a quiet nod. Respectability in a village was fragile glass-wound crack, however small, could echo for years. The Hallam death had created such cracks. Ben's gaze flicked again toward the vicarage. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, Mother will be waiting." He departed quickly, leaving behind the faint scent of fresh bread and a ripple of unease. Miss Marple continued down the lane toward the lich gate, her steps unhurried but thoughtful. The sky above the churchyard shifted from pale blue to a muted grey, as though the day itself hesitated between clarity and concealment, a fitting mirror to the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead. Near the gate, she noticed Mrs. Price Ridley whispering urgently to Mrs. Bartlett. Both fell abruptly silent when they spotted her, then resumed their murmured exchange at a more innocuous volume. Could be revenge, Harriet, years after the fact. You know how these grudges linger. Or someone trying to frighten the vicar. They say Edwin Hallam left debts and an unfortunate reputation, Miss Marple moved post, with polite acknowledgement, their words trailing behind like crumbs of certainty they hoped would lead somewhere simple. Villagers preferred a tidy explanation, even if it wasn't the correct one. She paused by the church notice board, allowing the murmurs to fade. What lingered instead was the torn scrap in her glove, its intent, its hesitancy. Not a young man's hand. Not Ben's. Not the vicar's. Miss Hartnell's writing, however, did possess a firmness that could wobble under strain. But there were others still unconsidered. She turned onto the footpath leading toward the Hallam cottage, now occupied by Mr. Pomeroy, a civil, solitary gentleman who kept largely to himself. The curtains were drawn, though the hour was hardly late enough to justify it. A single plume of chimney smoke suggested someone home. As she approached the garden gate, it creaked open from within. Mr. Pomeroy emerged, locking the door behind him with the sort of deliberate care that often accompanied private worry. He was startled when he saw her. "Miss Marple." "I didn't expect I was just stepping out." "Such a lovely morning," she replied warmly. "I was passing and thought of Mr. Hallam. I wondered whether anything of his remained here, papers, books, old drawers. Things have a way of lingering." Mr. Pomeroy swallowed. "You mean because of the letter?" "I've heard." His anxiety was immediate, unmasked, and yet there was something rehearsed about it, an alertness too smooth, as though he had anticipated this very conversation. "Nothing of Mr. Hallam's remains," he said quickly. "Absolutely nothing. The place was cleared before I moved in." Miss Marple offered a mild smile, though inwardly she noted every hurried denial. Of course, of course. He stepped past her, but as he did, a small folded paper slipped from his coat pocket and fluttered to the path. Instinctively, she bent to retrieve it. "Allow me," she said. But Mr. Pomeroy snatched it with a speed that jarred the courteous scene. His face drained of color. "It's nothing," he said tightly. "A shopping list." Yet the tremor in his hand as he pocketed it again matched almost too closely the one she had seen on the torn scrap. Mr. Pomeroy's hand hovered awkwardly near his coat pocket, as though afraid the folded paper might leap free again. His attempt at composure faltered under Miss Marple's calm, observant gaze. A single bead of perspiration glimmered at his temple, despite the cool breeze drifting across the lane. "I really must go," he said stiffly. "Of course," Miss Marple replied with gentle warmth. "Errands have their own urgency." He nodded too quickly and moved past her with constrained steps, each footfall striking the gravel as though he were counting them. His unease lingered in the air, long after he had vanished around the bend. Miss Marple remained at the garden gate a moment longer. The shutters of the Hallam cottage, still drawn tight despite the daylight, seemed to hold their own breath, guarded, withdrawn, concealing more than simply sunlight. A symbol, perhaps, of the village's collective instinct, Close the curtains, hide the clutter, hope the past will stay politely silent. But the past seldom obliged. As Miss Marple walked back toward the green, she noticed Inspector Graves turning into the high street with brisk purpose. He spotted her at once and approached, lifting a hand in greeting. "Ah, Miss Marple, I've spoken to Mr. Clegg and checked the delivery schedules. No irregularities." But he lowered his voice. "Someone left a second letter at the station." Miss Marple's brows rose faintly. "A second?" "Yes. Found on the platform bench by Porter Finch. Same type of envelope, same pristine stamp. No postmark, but this one wasn't addressed to anyone in the village." "Indeed," she murmured. "To whom then?" Graves hesitated, understanding the weight of the name. It was addressed to Edwin Hallam as well. The revelation spread a subtle chill along the pavement, as if the very cobblestones absorbed its unsettling implications. "2 letters," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Delivered by different means, yet bearing the same intention. Someone is quite determined." "That's my worry," Graves admitted. "Either someone's playing at spirits, which I doubt someone's engineering a message for the living by addressing it to the dead. And leaving it publicly," Miss Marple added, "where it would most certainly be found." Graves gave a short nod. The window delivery at the vicarage might have been private, almost secretive. But the station bench, that's practically an announcement. A group of villagers drifted by, their glances flicking toward the pair with thinly disguised interest. Graves sighed. "The rumors are spreading like wildfire. Miss Hartnell is insisting it's a foreign plot, Mrs. Price Ridley is sure it's an act of vengeance, and Mrs. Bartlett has already speculated about coded threats." Miss Marple offered a faint smile. People fear what they don't understand. And sometimes that fear encourages the most elaborate explanations. "Any thoughts on who might want this kind of attention?" he asked quietly. "Attention," Miss Marple said, "or reaction. They are not always the same." He studied her expression. "You've noticed something." "Only small things," she replied. "Small things often matter." She did not elaborate about Mr. Pomeroy's trembling hand or the scrap of matching paper resting in her glove. A clue half revealed was often more telling than one presented too soon. They had just reached the corner by the telephone box when a sudden commotion erupted near the grocer's. Mrs. Bartlett cried out sharply, and a cluster of shoppers turned. Miss Marple and Graves quickened their steps. On the ground beside the shop's wooden crates lay a third envelope, cream-colored, perfect, unmistakable. Mrs. Bartlett held her gloved hands to her mouth as though she feared even breathing might disturb it. "I wasn't anywhere near it," she insisted. "I swear it wasn't here a moment ago." Graves knelt to inspect it. Miss Marple watched the subtle tightening of his jaw as he lifted the envelope into the light. "Another for Edwin Hallam," he said grimly. A ripple of dread moved through the small crowd gathering behind them. Miss Hartnell, arriving breathlessly, jabbed her walking stick toward the envelope. "This is a sign," she declared. "A warning. Someone is stirring trouble for the village." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the people around her. Miss Hartnell flushed with indignation, Mrs. Bartlett pale with fright, and on the edge of the gathering, Ben Lacey lingering with a look that shifted uneasily between curiosity and fear. Not watching the envelope, but watching the inspector's reaction to it. And beyond them, almost out of sight, Mr. Pomeroy stood half hidden behind a lamp post, as though lurking in the shadow of his own thoughts. A quiet intuition stirred neither suspicion nor certainty, but something in between. Miss Marple let the ripple of unease settle over the assembled villagers, observing how each face stiffened into its preferred expression: fear, indignation, speculation, or the wish not to be noticed at all. She noticed, too, how Mr. Pomeroy withdrew further into the shelter of the lamp-post, while Ben Lacey's gaze hovered between the inspector and the newest envelope, as though weighing what either might demand of him. Inspector Graves carefully sealed the third envelope in a protective sleeve. "This is no prank," he muttered. 3 letters in a single morning. Someone is orchestrating this? Or confessing, Mrs. Bartlett whispered dramatically. "Hush, Hetty," Mrs. Price Ridley snapped, though her own voice trembled. Miss Hartnell lifted her chin. "Whoever is doing this is trying to make fools of us. The village must stand firm." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Firmness, dear Miss Hartnell, can sometimes stamp too heavily on fragile truths." The remark earned her a suspicious frown, but she was already turning her attention to the envelopes now gathered in Inspector Graves' pocket. 3 identical messages, yet not messages at all, for none had been opened. Their content, whatever it might be, remained sealed, like the facade of genteel respectability the village clung to in times of confusion. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I should like to speak with Mr. Clegg again. Not publicly. Quiet questions often yield clearer answers than loud ones." Graves nodded. "I can arrange that, but do you have something specific in mind?" "Only threads," she murmured. "But threads, when pulled carefully, do lead somewhere." While Graves continued to manage the agitated crowd, Miss Marple slipped away, pausing only to glance at Ben Lacey. He had not moved. His hands, she noted, were clenched tightly at his sides, a rigidity that suggested he had been holding one thought too long. "Ben," she said gently as she approached, "your mother must be expecting you." He was startled. "Yes, I ought to go," but he didn't. His gaze darted toward the vicarage once more, carrying the unmistakable burden of someone torn between fear of involvement and fear of silence. "I assure you," Miss Marple said softly, "terrible things are rarely eased by running from them." He swallowed hard. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I believe you," she replied simply. His shoulders sagged, the tension of the morning briefly loosening. But before he could say more, he turned abruptly and strode away, leaving behind the faintest impression that something unspoken had pressed dangerously close to the surface. Miss Marple continued down the street toward the post office. The bell above the door jingled brightly when she entered, but the room felt strangely dim despite the sunlight beyond the window. Mr. Clegg straightened at the counter. "Miss Marple, Inspector Graves said you might stop by." "I told him everything, honestly." "I have no doubt," she said kindly. "But I wondered if you might help me with a small matter. 3 envelopes have appeared now, all unmarked. I'm curious, has anyone recently purchased matching stationery? The sort sold in sets, perhaps a small box of cream paper?" He rubbed his palms nervously along the countertop. "Not to my knowledge. People tend to buy the assorted packets, you know." "But well," his gaze flicked involuntarily toward the back room. "Yes?" Miss Marple coaxed, her voice patient as warm water. He wrung his hands. "Mr. Pomeroy asked last week if I still kept those old notepaper sets, the ones with the cream finish and thick edges. I told him I had a box or 2 left from years ago. He bought one." He swallowed. "Said he liked good paper." "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple murmured. "And did anyone else inquire?" "Only one. Miss Hartnell, but she only wanted envelopes. Her church correspondence must be immaculate, she says." The contrast struck her subtly, Pomeroy seeking paper, Hartnell seeking envelopes. The village, she thought, was never as tidy as its inhabitants wished to believe. She thanked Mr. Clegg and stepped outside again. The breeze had grown cooler, brushing the surface of her glove where the torn scrap still rested. That small fragment felt suddenly emblematic and incomplete truth, torn from a larger design, trembling with the faint imprint of a hesitant hand. But whether that hand belonged to fear, to guilt, or to something gentler remained to be seen. The cool breeze lifted the edge of Miss Marple's glove, stirring the hidden scrap as though encouraging her to look again. But she did not. Some clues required patience. They revealed themselves only when the emotional weather of a village shifted enough to illuminate them. Across the high street, Inspector Graves emerged from the eyed grocer's with the third envelope secured in its sleeve. He spotted Miss Marple and crossed the road with deliberate steps. "I'm heading to the station," he said. The porter might have seen something unusual, but truthfully, Miss Marple, I feel we're missing the thread. 3 letters, same style, same intention. It's too precise. Precision, Miss Marple said softly, can be the refuge of a troubled conscience. When one seeks to regain control, one often becomes meticulous. Graves paused. You think the letters are an attempt to control something? To control a memory, perhaps? Or a suspicion? Or even a feeling left unfinished? He frowned thoughtfully, but before he could respond, a harsh voice chimed in from behind. There you are. Miss Hartnell marched toward them with a brisk, almost military pace. Her cheeks were flushed, her walking stick thrust forward like a pointer on a blackboard. "Inspector," she declared, "I must insist you visit Mr. Pomeroy immediately. He was lurking behind that lamp-post like a vagabond. A respectable man does not skulk during important matters." Miss Hartnell, Graves sighed. "Loitering is not a crime." "It ought to be," she snapped. "People with nothing to hide do not conceal themselves in the shadows." Miss Marple watched her closely. The woman's agitation had ripened beyond eagerness. It now had an almost brittle quality, like porcelain under strain. And what struck Miss Marple most was not Miss Hartnell's indignation, but her urgency to direct suspicion away from herself and toward others. "Were you at the station this morning?" Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Hartnell stiffened. "Why would I be? To collect your church correspondence, perhaps, or to meet someone." "I have no reason to meet anyone," she retorted too quickly, "and certainly not at the station." Her denial rang with a curious sharpness, brittle at its edges. Miss Marple tucked that reaction carefully into her mental ledger. Miss Hartnell continued her tirade with renewed zeal. "I've said all along that these letters must be foreign in origin, sent by some agent with an agenda." "Foreign," Graves repeated, struggling not to sigh. "Yes, no English person would go to such theatrical lengths." Miss Marple's voice remained serenely calm. "Theatricality, dear Miss Hartnell, is by no means limited to the foreign." Miss Hartnell flushed fiercely and turned on her heel, marching away with offended rigidity. Graves glanced sideways at Miss Marple. "She's a piece of work, that one." "A piece," Miss Marple agreed. "That fits somewhere in the puzzle. But where, we have not yet seen." Graves nodded grimly. "And Mr. Pomeroy? He's behaving oddly too." "Yes," she said. "But oddness is not guilt. Sometimes it hides grief or fear." "And Ben Lacey?" he pressed. Miss Marple considered. "Ben has the look of someone standing at the wrong doorway, wondering whether he ought to knock." Graves rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll speak with all of them." "Carefully. That is wise," she said. "But allow me a small suggestion. Ask not who delivered the letters, but who needed them to be found." That gave him pause. True revelations often sprang not from the act, but from the intention behind it. As Graves headed toward the station, Miss Marple resumed her walk along the lane, her pace unhurried. She passed the vicarage gate, still slightly ajar from the morning's commotion. The garden, usually so orderly, now showed faint signs of disturbance, shuffled gravel, a displaced pot, the air faintly unsettled. Mrs. Clement appeared in the doorway, pale and anxious. "Miss Marple, have you heard?" "A third letter. Yes, my dear. Inspector Graves has taken it." Mrs. Clement wrung her hands. "The vicar has been beside himself. He's locked the study door. He won't let me in." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "men seek solitude when something touches a nerve they thought long buried." Mrs. Clement hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Do you think this has something to do with that day, with Mr. Hallam's collapse?" The village believes many things, Miss Marple replied. Belief and truth are rarely close companions. Mrs. Clement seemed about to speak further when a faint sound drifted from within the house, a soft, shuddering noise, quickly stifled. Not the vicar. Someone else. Miss Marple's gaze narrowed thoughtfully. Someone inside the vicarage was crying. The soft, shuddering sob drifted again, barely audible, but unmistakable. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly toward the vicarage hallway. Mrs. Clement froze, a hand pressed against her chest. "Oh dear, I hadn't realized anyone else was here," she whispered. "It isn't the vicar. He never cries." Miss Marple stepped gently into the hall, her voice warm but low. "There is no shame in tears, my dear. Sorrow has its own timetable." A muffled rustle answered her as she approached the half-open parlor door. Through the narrow gap, she glimpsed a woman's shoes, sensible brown leather, and the faint motion of a hand dabbing at a handkerchief. Miss Marple tapped lightly. "May I come in?" The door opened a fraction wider, revealing Mrs. Lacey, Ben Lacey's mother. Her eyes redrimmed and her composure as thin as tissue. She startled at the sight of Miss Marple, but attempted a smile that crumpled at its edges. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to disturb anyone." Mrs. Clement let me wait here while she looked for the vicar. I'd hoped to speak with him privately. Miss Marple entered with gentle care, as though stepping into the fragile atmosphere of a sick room. "You are most welcome here. But you seem troubled." Mrs. Lacey pressed the handkerchief to her lips. "It's Ben. He didn't sleep at all last night. He said he dreamed of Mr. Hallam-White as chalk standing in the vicarage garden. This morning he insisted on walking into the village early, before breakfast, and when he returned, her breath trembled. He was pale as milk. I know something's wrong." Miss Marple settled beside her, letting silence cushion the confession. Mrs. Lacey continued in a strained whisper. "Ben found something in his father's study last week. A box of old papers, receipts, letters, things from before the war. He wouldn't tell me what he saw inside, but he burned half of it in the garden stove." She swallowed. And then the letters began arriving. Miss Marple felt the quiet alignment of two separate threads the stamps Ben had asked about, and the sudden fear that shadowed him. But alignment was not the same as truth. "Your husband," Miss Marple said softly, "served on the Village Improvements Committee years ago, did he not? With Mr. Hallam?" Mrs. Lacey nodded. "Yes, they quarreled. It upset my husband terribly. He never forgave himself for losing his temper." She hesitated, lowering her voice further. "Ben believes father kept something from that quarrel, something he never explained." Miss Marple reached gently for her hand. Secrets left unattended have a habit of resurfacing. Mrs. Lacey shivered. "Ben thinks someone is punishing him, punishing us for something long buried, but Mr. Hallam has been dead for years. Why now? Why torment the village all over again?" A faint click interrupted the sound of a door upstairs opening. The vicar descended the steps slowly, his expression taut, as though bracing himself against unwelcome knowledge. "I apologize," he said quietly. "I heard voices. Mrs. Lacey, you wish to see me?" She nodded, embarrassed. "Yes, vicar. I'm afraid something awful is happening, and Ben here may be caught up in it somehow." The vicar's gaze drifted briefly toward Miss Marple, seeking her silent counsel. She responded with the slightest shake of her head. The truth needed gentler ground before it could be safely unearthed. Before the vicar could speak, a sharp rap sounded at the front door. Not hesitant like Mrs. Lacey's knock, nor official like Inspector Graves's. A single, urgent strike. Mrs. Clement hurried to answer it. A moment later, she reappeared, pale. "It's for you, vicar." Someone left something on the doorstep. They followed her to the entryway. On the mat lay a fourth envelope. Cream. pristine, unmarked, but with one stark difference. This one was addressed not to Edwin Hallam, but to Ben Lacey. A faint, collective breath seemed to leave the hallway, as if the village itself had taken a step closer to something it feared to name. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not with accusation, but with the delicate tension of a thought on the verge of completion. For a long moment, no one moved. The fourth envelope lay on the mat like a stray heartbeat, quiet yet unnervingly alive. Mrs. Lacey pressed a trembling hand to her lips, while the vicar stepped back as though the name written upon it was something volatile. Miss Marple, however, bent slightly forward, her gaze soft but sharpened by years of observing the ways guilt and fear shaped human behavior. "It seems," she murmured, "that whoever sends these letters wishes to change their audience." Mrs. Clement exhaled shakily. "But why Ben? He's barely involved in anything. He keeps to himself, poor boy." Miss Marple noted the envelope's placement centered precisely upon the mat, not shoved or tossed. The handwriting, though carefully formed, bore a faint unevenness at the ends of the strokes, like a hand fighting the tremor of memory. "Mrs. Clement," she said gently, "would you be so kind as to fetch Ben? His mother ought not face this alone." Mrs. Lacey clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Oh, must he see it? He's distraught enough." "Distress," Miss Marple said kindly, "should not be left to grow in the dark. It thrives there." Mrs. Clement departed at once. The vicar sank into the hallway chair, looking suddenly older. "Miss Marple, we cannot permit this to continue. Whoever is doing this means harm, if not physical, then moral, and moral harm, as you know, can spread like a stain." "That it can," Miss Marple agreed. "But stains often appear where fabric has been weakened beforehand." He looked at her sharply, as though recognizing a meaning he wished not to confront. Before he could speak, footsteps sounded outside, and Ben entered the hall with Mrs. Clement behind him. He halted abruptly when he saw the envelope. His face was drained of color. "No," he whispered. Mrs. Lacey rushed to him. "Ben, my dear, what is it? Why would anyone send this to you?" He shook his head, unable to tear his eyes from it. Miss Marple observed him closely. The flicker of fear, yes, but also something deeper. A recognition, perhaps, not of the handwriting, but of the intention behind it. Inspector Graves arrived moments later, summoned by Mrs. Clement's hastily scribbled note. He examined the envelope with a grim crease in his brow. Addressed to the lad himself. He turned to Miss Marple. "Whoever's behind this is escalating. First Hallam, now the boy. They're building towards something." "Sometimes escalation is a sign," Miss Marple replied softly, "not of boldness, but of desperation." Ben's hands shook. He pressed them to his temples. "It's because of father," he said hoarsely. "It must be." Mrs. Lacey gasped. "Ben, no, your father never harmed anyone." Ben looked at her with sudden anguish. "I don't know that, Mother. I don't know anything anymore. Those papers I found, I shouldn't have burned them. I thought they were nothing." But then the letters began. Inspector Graves braced himself. "What papers?" Ben wiped his eyes. "Old committee documents, notes about expenses, letters from Mr. Hallam. I only skimmed them. Some of it looked like accusations or threats." I panicked. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice soothing. "My dear boy, burning them was unwise, but hardly criminal. What matters is your fear. Tell us what frightened you." Ben hesitated, then spoke in a low, cracking voice. "There was a line in one of the letters. Something Hallam wrote to my father. He said, 'If the truth comes out, neither of us will escape unscathed.'" Mrs. Lacey let out a soft cry. Graves exhaled sharply. So the quarrel was worse than we knew. Miss Marple regarded Ben with gentleness. "And did you believe your father was capable of wrongdoing?" "No," Ben whispered. "But I can't be certain. Now that these letters are appearing, it feels like someone is trying to tell me father hid something." Miss Marple let silence gather for a moment. Then she spoke, slowly, each word carefully chosen. Ben's secrets often look darker in hindsight, especially when grief has not been given its proper place. She turned to Graves. "Inspector, may I speak with Ben alone?" Only for a moment. Graves nodded, ushering the others toward the sitting room. Miss Marple led Ben into the small vestibule near the cloakroom window, the same window through which the first letter might have slipped. "Ben," she said quietly. "Fear narrows one's sight. It makes every shadow look like a figure waiting to accuse. But tell me honestly, do you believe these letters come from someone who wishes to harm you?" He hesitated. "I don't know. They feel like warnings. But not all warnings mean danger, do they?" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Sometimes a warning is really a plea for recognition, for closure, for someone to understand something left unsaid." Ben's eyes filled again. He rubbed the sleeve of his jumper across them. "Miss Marple, I didn't put any letter anywhere, but I keep thinking, what if someone knows something about Father that I don't?" Miss Marple touched his arm gently. "Then we shall learn it. Together." A quiet resolve flickered in him, faint but genuine. Just then, a movement in the corridor caught her eyes, shifting shadow along the wall. Someone who had been listening, leaning back now into hiding. Not Ben, not Mrs. Lacey, not the vicar. A different step. Lighter. Tense. Miss Marple's gaze followed the retreating shadow as it slipped away toward the kitchen. A thought stirred a quiet, steadying clarity. The retreating shadow slipped along the skirting board, dissolving into the darker stretch of the corridor that led toward the kitchen. Miss Marple, still standing beside Ben in the narrow vestibule, tilted her head as though listening to a change in the room's breath. "Ben, my dear," she murmured, "stay with your mother for a moment. You needn't worry, I shall not be long." He nodded shakily and stepped back into the sitting room. Miss Marple moved toward the kitchen with her customary, unassuming tread-light, almost drift-like, yet every sense finely tuned. The corridor held the faint warmth of recently occupied air, the slight disturbance that lingered after someone had pressed themselves into stillness, listening too closely. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Clement standing near the table, her hands gripping the edge so tightly the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. She was startled when Miss Marple entered. "Oh, Miss Marple, goodness. You gave me a fright." Miss Marple offered her a gentle smile. "I'm so sorry, my dear, but I couldn't help noticing you slipped away rather hurriedly." Mrs. Clement colored deeply, eyes darting toward the back door. "I only came to fetch tea. Everyone seems so distressed." Miss Marple stepped softly nearer, her voice calm as a quiet clock. "It can be difficult to hear painful conversations. One sometimes feels one ought not to listen, and yet cannot tear oneself away." Mrs. Clement's breath hitched. The facade wavered. "I didn't mean to overhear," she whispered. "Truly I didn't." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "My dear, if one tries too hard not to listen in a small house, the house often conspires against us." Mrs. Clement's eyes glistened, her shoulders trembled. Ben looked so frightened. And Mrs. Lacey, oh, the poor woman. All this talk about old quarrels and hidden papers, what if something dreadful really did happen years ago? What if the letters are meant to expose it? Miss Marple noted the tremor in her voice. Not the tremor of guilt, but of someone stretched thin by anxieties she had never learned to voice. "Would you tell me," Miss Marple asked softly, "why you seemed so distressed just now? Was it something Ben said that unsettled you?" Mrs. Clement pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "No, it wasn't him." She swallowed. "It was the vicar." Miss Marple waited. "He hasn't been himself lately. All morning he's been pacing, muttering that the past never stays buried. I asked if he meant Mr. Hallam, and he said no, not exactly. But he looked so haunted, as though some part of him feared these letters were a reckoning. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. Did he ever speak with Mr. Hallam privately before the garden party? Mrs. Clement nodded reluctantly. Once, a week before Mr. Hallam died. I didn't hear what they discussed, but the vicar came back pale and tight-lipped. He said he feared the man would bring trouble to the parish. She wrung her hands. I'd forgotten that until today. Trouble, Miss Marple reflected, often lived in people's private anxieties long before it made its public debut. Mrs. Clement suddenly looked at her with frightened earnestness. Miss Marple, do you think the vicar is afraid someone will believe he wronged Mr. Hallam? Appearances can be misleading, my dear. Guilt is not the only cause of fear. Sometimes it is compassion, or shame, or the memory of having failed someone. Before Mrs. Clement could reply, a harsh knock sounded at the front door louder, sharper than any that had preceded it. Miss Marple felt the kitchen stiffen around them. I'll go, she said gently. They returned to the hallway where Inspector Graves was already stepping inside, face flushed from haste. I've just come from the station, he announced, eyes sharp. The porter revealed something important. Someone was seen near the bench before the second letter was found, someone wearing a dark coat and hat. Not a man, he said. A woman. Miss Hartnell, hovering at the threshold of the sitting room as though she had materialized out of indignation, drew herself up. Well, that hardly narrows matters. Half the village wears hats. Graves ignored her. His gaze swept the hall. I need to know who was out early this morning, before 8. Mrs. Clement's hand flew to her mouth, but that was when she caught herself abruptly, eyes widening at her own near confession. Graves turned to her. When you what, Mrs. Clement? She shook her head quickly. I only stepped out to fetch milk. Nothing unusual. Miss Marple watched the exchange closely. Mrs. Clement's distress had deepened since their kitchen conversation. Something inside her warred between truth and propriety. But it was not the tension of guilt, rather of someone who feared how truth might be interpreted. Inspector, Miss Marple said softly, it might be prudent to consider that the early morning hours draw out private burdens. People who wander then do not usually wander. Graves grunted. We'll need statements, all of them. The vicar emerged from the study at that moment, his face drawn tight. Inspector, I will tell you everything I know, he said quietly. I cannot let suspicion darken the parish. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him a moment, soft, searching, reflective. Something in his expression had altered, a decision having crystallized during his solitude. But before he could speak further, there was a sudden commotion from the sitting room, Mrs. Lacey's voice rising in alarm. Ben, what are you doing? Miss Marple hurried in. Ben Lacey stood by the low table, the unopened fourth envelope clutched in his hand. His expression carried a terrible resolve. I'm going to open it, he said. Ben stood motionless, the envelope trembling faintly in his grip as though it carried more weight than paper should. Mrs. Lacey clutched his sleeve in panic. Ben, don't please. What if it's dreadful? Inspector Graves moved to intervene, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand. Let him hold it, Inspector. But Ben, my dear, before you tear that seal, may I offer one small observation? Ben looked at her, torn between desperation and obedience. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes warm and steady. This letter will tell you very little, I'm afraid, because it was never written for you, not truly. It was written for someone who hoped you would recognize something long unspoken. He frowned, confusion overriding his fear. Recognize what? A truth about your father, Miss Marple said softly, and about the person who has been sending these letters. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Inspector Graves straightened, Miss Hartnell craned forward, and Mrs. Clement clutched the door frame as though needing its support. Miss Marple turned first to Graves. "Inspector, you have seen the handwriting on each envelope. A neat hand, carefully shaped, but with a slight tremor not youthful nor naturally shaky, but the tremor of someone forcing their hand to obey an old memory." Graves nodded slowly. "Yes, I thought of that. And when a person forces their hand," Miss Marple continued, "they tighten their grip. That produces tiny hesitations on the downward strokes, the very same hesitations on the torn scrap I found in the hedge outside the cloakroom window." Ben froze. "Scrap? There was a scrap?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and it bore the same small tremor." She turned her clear, gentle gaze. "Mr. Pomeroy, would you step closer?" Mr. Pomeroy started visibly, as though struck. "Me? Don't know anything about—" "Please," Miss Marple said, in a tone that allowed no retreat. He came forward stiffly, avoiding the eyes of the villagers. Ben stared at him. "Why would you send letters to Hallam? And to me?" Mr. Pomeroy shook his head. I didn't write anything." Miss Marple's voice remained serene. "I believe you wrote very little of it, Mr. Pomeroy. Only the envelopes, and only for someone who could no longer write at all." Silence thickened the air. Mrs. Clement gasped softly. "Miss Marple, no, you can't mean." Miss Marple turned to her gently. "My dear, you have been carrying sorrow quietly for a great long while. You thought the vicar, who kept Mr. Hallam's confidence, might reveal something best forgotten, and when Ben burned his father's papers, you feared the truth they held might vanish forever." Mrs. Clement's breath hitched. The room tightened around her. Ben's voice came out barely audible. "Mrs. Clement?" Her eyes filled. "I only wanted someone to listen to see that Edwin Hallam wasn't the villain they all made him. He never misused the committee funds. He loaned money to your father. Bento spared him scandal. And he wrote threatening letters only to force repayment because he feared the vicar's involvement would worsen things." Ben swayed as though struck by a blow. Mrs. Clement pressed a hand to her heart. "Your father did repay it, every shilling. But when Mr. Hallam died so suddenly at the garden party, people whispered terrible things. They said he'd argued with the vicar. They said he was dishonest, and no one defended him, not even the vicar, who knew the truth but feared being dragged into gossip." The vicar bowed his head, shame etched into his posture. Miss Marple continued gently. "Mrs. Clement cared for Mr. Hallam more deeply than anyone realized. She alone tended him in his final moments while the others panicked. She heard his last words, and she bore that sorrow alone, fearing the village would twist her grief into scandal." Mrs. Clement sobbed. "I couldn't bear it. Every year it grew heavier. When Ben found those papers, I thought perhaps the moment had come. Perhaps the village could know kindness again. I asked Mr. Pomeroy, dear man. He's always helped me with small errands to address the envelopes because I could no longer write without shaking." Mr. Pomeroy spoke in a low, pained whisper. "I thought she wanted to send flowers to someone. I didn't know, not at first." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on Mrs. Clement's arm. "You hoped the letters would force the truth into the open. But truth, my dear, rarely comes gently when forced." Mrs. Clement nodded, tears falling freely. "I never meant to frighten anyone, only to remind them that Mr. Hallam was a good man, that he deserved his name spoken with kindness." Ben stepped forward, eyes shining with sudden understanding. "Mrs. Clement father never told me any of this. He was ashamed," she whispered. "He didn't want you carrying the weight he carried." Mrs. Lacey clutched her son, relief and sorrow entwined. Inspector Graves exhaled, his sternness softened. "Well, we've had mysteries before, but rarely ones born of grief rather than malice." Miss Hartnell looked chastened for the first time in memory. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room with tender resonance. Perhaps now, with the truth no longer wandering in the shadows, the village may breathe again. Ben, shaking, opened the final envelope. Inside lay a single blank page. Not accusation, no warning, a plea for someone to listen. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Sometimes the quietest cries," she said softly, "are the ones we most need to hear."